Chapter 8. The One That Got Away. EA slowly stirred. He was awake far, far too early. Outside it was dark with only a few speckles of stars to light the way. Inside wasn't much better. He could hear the rhythmic sounds of Annie's snoring mingling with the crashing of waves. Grouchily he pushed himself up, knowing he wasn't going to fall back asleep easily. Rummaging in his bag, he found the book he had taken from Maemia's library. A pang of guilt grabbed at him, but he knew this was his best chance at solving that problem, even if he had stolen it, something he had quietly promised not to do again when he was in the army. He needed to find out where he'd got up to, but some of the pages had been frozen shut since their mishap in Noema. He tentatively peeled at the corners of one, but the ink started to come away from the page and he stopped at once. This book was determined to fall apart. "That's no way to behave," he muttered. "I didn't risk stealing you for nothing. Now cooperate." He tried again. Ever so slowly, the pages loosened. Holding his breath, EA gently pulled them open and found his bookmark encased inside. At last! As I discussed in the previous chapters, it is essential to understand our world is constructed of layers, separated by the veil known as the fabric of reality. Of course, our subject matter does not... EA caught himself. Perhaps he shouldn't read out loud. He didn't want anyone overhearing and finding out what he was up to. He settled for reading in his head. Captain Oola had told them it would take 15 days to reach the area of the sea where everyone agreed the island Allaire should be. However, they were delayed by almost 3 more days thanks to their altercation with the snowmen, and, what was more, the winds were now soft and lazy, leaving the sails hanging limp. After all the recent excitement, this sudden drop in pace left everyone with a lot of energy and nowhere to put it. No one felt this more than Annie and Prince Dominator, who had never been models of patience to begin with, and were now liable to small explosions at the slightest hindrance to their daily routines. The ATR might have been used to this, but for the uninitiated sailors it was fast becoming extremely irritating. Worse still, it was often GA, their beacon of bad luck, who ended up getting the brunt of their frustration. Having grown tired of being quietly told by his brother to either ignore them or seek vengeance, GA had retreated upwards. He knew it was all nonsense, and felt sure some of the Nausians didn't actually mean what they said. In fact, he really didn't mind staying up amid the masts above the hubbub. From there he could observe all the activity, business and talk below without anyone walking through him or whispering to one another. Once upon a time he might have found this lonely, but these days he was beginning to enjoy being in his own company. It was a chance for some peace and quiet, to simply be in his own thoughts and watch life pass him by. A chance for a ghost to just be a ghost. He was still thinking about how Prince Tepid knew his father, and reeling at the idea that he'd been working for the king. Or had it been working while under arrest at the king's orders? What had he done to get arrested? Had Jam really been in Tepid's castle all along, while GA and EA had been living on Nausia's streets? GA had an awful lot of questions, and often encouraged Tepid to tell him more, but the prince had been rather preoccupied with other matters, namely a small one called Prince Dominator. Down below, Dominator had been making such a nuisance of himself, declaring how things were going too slowly, that no one was pulling their weight, that he had nothing to do, that by the 10th day the sailors collectively petitioned Captain Oola to have him tied to a long piece of rope and dangled over the side of the ship where they couldn't hear him. It was only thanks to Tepid that Oola was persuaded otherwise. In the end, Dominator was taken off all other duties and sent to the galley. It was where he had the least to complain about, because that was where there was food. And so, at the changing of the watch that afternoon, GA decided to pass the time by exploring down below and see how Dominator was faring. But as he glided noiselessly through the depths of the ship, Dominator was nowhere to be seen, the stove lifeless, and utensils abandoned. Wondering what could have happened, GA scoured the rest of the deck, but found nothing. Just when he was wondering how likely it was for the prince to have somehow cooked himself, he heard a clatter from somewhere below. After a quick search and some careful listening, he heard more clattering. It had come from the hatch that led to what the sailors called the hold. Drifting down the steep steps, Bligh came to a low, cavernous space, tightly packed with ballast and stores. The sloping walls of the ship made it a narrow squeeze if he couldn't float through things. The imposing shapes of barrels, crates and boxes of all sizes towered around him in the gloom, and the whole space was filled with the thick, sloshing atmosphere that comes from being inside something submerged under water. Dominator stood at the far end, a lantern in one hand and a peculiar look on his face. As Bligh's soft glow lit the walls nearest, he turned about abruptly.
"Oh, it's you. Do you need something?"
Bligh shrugged.
"No,"
he said honestly.
"I was just wondering what you were doing down here."
Dominator looked very hard at him for a moment, and then lowered his voice.
"Can you keep a secret?" "I think so,"
said Bligh before he'd really thought about it. The prince beckoned him closer and pointed to a row of 6 of the largest barrels standing on top of a dozen wooden crates marked with the Nausian crest.
"These barrels are full of our drinking water. They're stupidly heavy, and some numpties put them on top of our food supplies." "Do you need someone to lift them off?"
asked Bligh. Dominator snorted and scrambled up several nearby boxes, took hold of the rim of the nearest barrel, and with one hand tipped it over as if it was an empty bucket. Bligh stared as he hopped back down.
"It's empty?" "Yes,"
whispered Dominator, a manic, nervous grin on his face.
"And guess what? The others are pretty much all the same." "But how could—" "I don't know,"
said Dominator shrilly.
"That's not the best part, though. Look here."
With trembling hands, he pulled open the front of one of the crates beneath the barrels. It was full of sacks of grains, vegetables and dried fruits. Or, that's what they should have been. The contents of the sack Dominator tugged open looked as if they'd tried to digest themselves.
"It's all soaked!"
exclaimed Bligh.
"They're all the same, all of it,"
said Dominator.
"How come no one noticed this earlier?"
asked Bligh.
"I'm the first to open these,"
croaked Dominator, gazing into the slush as if it was his grave.
"We only finished using the crates stacked on the other side this morning. When the captain finds out, he's going to eat me." "Don't be ridiculous,"
said Bligh.
"It's not your fault." "What's whose fault?"
said a voice behind them. Dominator dropped the sack. Morphea was at the foot of the hatch steps. It was amazing how she could make casually holding a spoon look that threatening. Clearly she, like Bligh, had come to see where Dominator had got to. Without batting an eye, she strode between them, knelt to examine the dismal contents spilling from the dropped sack, then pulled open a second crate and heaved out more of the sad, pre-digested mess.
"Oh my!"
Dominator leapt back, gaping in theatrical shock.
"G.A., what did you do?"
There was a very serious discussion in the captain's cabin that evening. All the sailors, plus Tepid, who appeared to have honorary access, were inside. The failed notions were shut out on deck. Bligh sat by the door trying to hear what was being said, while scowling at Dominator. Presently, EA walked over to join him, a large book tucked under one arm. "I heard you destroyed our supplies."
"I did not, and you jolly well know it,"
snapped Bligh. I know, said EA. "I'm only teasing. What have they been saying?" He nodded to the sound of voices drifting through the woodwork.
"They think the water in those barrels froze in Shnoema,"
said Bligh.
"When we got away and the ice thawed, it warped the wood. The water leaked through into the crates and ruined the supplies."
"Oh, so not good," said EA, adjusting the bookmark in his book.
"No, and of course now Tepid's on board, that makes things even more tricky."
"Oh, of course. We hadn't stocked for an extra person on board when Gina popped up, let alone an extra person," observed EA.
"I suppose I'll have to cut back on the potatoes,"
grinned Bligh, patting where his stomach would have been.
"Though, you know, I can't actually remember what potatoes taste like these days,"
he added thoughtfully. "You can't?" said EA, glancing up at him. Bligh chuckled.
"Don't look so serious, EA. Your eyebrows will stick together."
The cabin door opened and they hastily got up. The rest of the failed notions looked round as Captain Oola emerged.
"Well, fact of the matter is, we seem to have struck bad luck,"
he announced calmly.
We have 5 or 6 days between here and our destination. We still have enough fresh water stored in the ship to get us by, but we've lost the majority of the food intended to see us to the islands.
Stupid barrels,
muttered Dominator. I hate to ask the obvious question, but what will we do until we get there? Asked Abrian.
Eat less, obviously,
said Gina. We ought to have enough if we're careful to ration what remains, said Tepid cheerfully, though the strained edges of his smile betrayed a hint that he was very aware he hadn't helped matters.
It will be a tight game, but yes,
nodded Bligh.
Chins up though, buttercups,
he added.
If you'll permit, sire, I'd like to show these chaps our little ray of sunshine in this situation.
He pulled out a heavy ledger he'd been carrying and spread it open on the rail. Chie peered over the heads of everyone from above and saw that each page was covered with carefully organised dates, numbers and tallies.
Myself and Seaward used to trade with one of the lands nearby,
Bligh explained.
I've had a discussion with the good captain, and we all agree that if we head 2 days a little further south while still holding our original course, we should reach the edge of their fishing grounds. With any luck, we'll be able to add to our provisions, and that'll see us through until we make port.
From what our ledger says,
added Seaward,
though these records are a little old, mind you, there should be bristlefish, skipperlings and glumpy. Those taste better than they sound.
Wait, those are... Failed notions don't eat... began Honno.
If no one has any objections, we will set out immediately,
cut in Captain Oola, snapping the ledger and the discussion shut.
To work with you, if you please, Mr. Honno.
He smiled at Honno, who was glaring suspiciously at him. Some of the sailors sniggered. As he made to float away, Chie was sure he heard Morland mutter to Seaward.
Surely this will help counter the ghost slug. Ouch!
Sorry, muttered EA, heaving his book off the sailor's foot. Must have slipped. He caught Chie's eye as he turned away. Grinning, Chie headed below. Despite Bligh's guidance, it was almost nightfall on the second day before they arrived at the edge of the fishing grounds. There were no markers or signs to indicate this, but the sailors were confident in their wisdom that this was close enough. They had to be careful not to sail any further into the grounds, or the fisherfolk who worked them might think the Nausian ship was stealing. Captain Oola had advised the crew to get on with the business, and to get it finished as soon as they could. Though Seaward and Bligh were the most experienced, the rest of the crew swiftly got to work, having been around the Nausian fishing fleet all their lives. The ATR, however, hung back. Fish had no place in the failed notion diet, where the general rule was why would you eat it if it can look back at you? All except Danny and Dominator, that is, who would eat anything on a needs-must basis.
Pull your weight, you lot,
called Seaward.
You're still in range, you know.
The sailors had been telling the failed notions they were still in range ever since Shnoema. Even if there were no crossbows in sight, it certainly made them do as they were told. Abrian looked doubtfully at the lines and nets that were being unpacked before them, and glanced at his companions.
Well, are you going to?
Asked Gina. I will if you will, said Honno.
You first.
I think I'd rather go without, said Abrian lightly.
What's the big problem?
Asked Annie, already looping feathered lures onto the lines.
Fish are nice.
I like fish when they're in the water, swimming, said Honno. It just doesn't feel right to try and stop them doing that.
I have to agree,
added Delilah.
But I am really hungry. Come on,
said Dominator.
Annie, show her how to get the hooks ready. Come on, all of you. You're embarrassing me, and this is me talking.
You just want food, grumbled Abrian. EA, who had been listening, suddenly looked up. Chie, what about sea fruit?
What?
Asked Chie, hovering beside the group. When we lived in Nausea, every so often a nice trader would give us any leftovers from their stands. There was a stew with all sorts of things in, vegetables and herbs and sea fruit. Do you remember? Chie screwed up his face.
Yes, I think there was something.
Well, said EA, looking hopefully to the others. Perhaps with our nets we can pick this fruit from the sea floor. Then we won't have to... But he was drowned out by a gale of laughter.
Oh,
Seafood.
laughed Haidur.
Oh, you dear innocent fruzzery things. You and your brother were eating fruit of the sea, were you?
With a mighty tug, he heaved a dripping net onto the deck and threw its wriggling, writhing contents at their feet.
Let me introduce you to the ocean's fruit bowl,
he said. The glistening turmoil of slapping creatures gazed up hopelessly into EA's face. EA stared back, all colour draining from him as every round, glassy eye seemed to look up at him as if to say, "That's right, you have no soul." "I'm going to bed," he said, turning on his heel and departing below, the slippery judgment of every creature under the sea resting on his shoulders. When no other options presented themselves, the rest of the ATR reluctantly stayed behind and, however grudgingly, began to make themselves useful. Gia floated beside Delilah and tried to help as she and Annie worked at untangling large nets and preparing ominous-looking hooks.
She must be really hungry,
he thought as he watched her stoically threading lures onto the lines, while determinedly not looking at the catch now being dispatched by the sailors beside them. He didn't quite understand how 2 days on half rations made so much difference to anyone. After all, he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten anything, even the fruit of the sea. But somehow it was certainly making a difference to his friends. Delilah especially did not do well on an empty stomach, and she had suffered the most from seasickness, even after everyone else had overcome theirs. She had been determined not to let this dampen her spirits, but the new rationing system was beginning to stretch her patience. That was why, after 5 minutes of trying to be helpful, Kie realised it was probably best if he kept his mouth shut and let her get on with it. The whole process seemed to take forever. Darkness was swiftly closing in, and a stiff breeze shredded the clouds above, stretching them raggedly across the hazy blue sky as stars peeked out to watch their work with an unblinking gaze. Though this lessened the rain that had been fizzling on everyone's heads, it did little to raise their spirits. As the night lowered itself around the ship, the fish seemed to sink away, drifting deep into the depths of the sea and far out of their reach. Seaward and Bligh fell into a whispered debate full of their private knowledge about what should be done. What they had caught was preserving in brine. After an hour it would be boiled in the biggest kettle, full of vinegar and spices and sealed in heavy jars. So far it wasn't very much to share between 6 Nausians and 8 failed notions. Honno stood on the poop deck, watching his lure dancing in the ship's wake. The waters beneath him remained defiantly empty. Secretly, he didn't mind this if it meant a couple of fish got away. He was sure he could manage on what they'd brought, without killing anything. He just had to make sure he put in as little effort as possible. When the blue-grey foam of the wake below became too dim to see, he stretched and began to reel in the line.
"What are you doing?"
Honno nearly fell off the ship. Looking round, then down, he saw Annie standing beside him.
"You aren't packing up, are you, Honno?"
she asked shrewdly. "It's too late to do anything today, Annie. There's no fish here," he said, continuing to reel in the line. Annie tutted disapprovingly.
"And this is why you'll never marry."
"Excuse me?"
"Didn't your auntie ever tell you there's plenty more fish in the sea?"
she said, seizing the line and flinging it back over the side. "There's nothing out there," said Honno, full of frustration.
"Do you mean to say,"
said Annie, her hands on her hips,
"that you're going to give up and leave me, your beloved Annie, to starve?"
"Any day," smirked Honno. Annie shook her head.
"Such a disappointment. Your auntie will cry when she finds out I had to eat you because her lazy, unfaithful, ungallant blonde nephew wouldn't catch me one little fishy for my din-dins."
It's too dark, Annie," spluttered Honno, his head trying to work out which part of that sentence he should be most insulted about. "And wait a minute, you're blonde too!"
"It's not too dark,"
said Annie.
"I'm here."
With a wave of her hand, pink magic flew from her fingers in dizzy spirals. She seized her hat, and the pink flew from her fingers through every thread and fibre to the pointed tip. The hat swelled, wriggled, and then burst into flames at the top. In one bound Annie was on the rail, and with a gleeful grin she hopped off the side. Her hat, jammed onto her head, bounced upwards like a bonfire that thought it was a bubble. Annie rose into the air like a cork, laughing with delight at Honno's face. As she rose higher, the hat's flames lit the whole ship with pink. The sailors stared in astonishment as Annie skipped over the mast, the foremast, then under the bowsprit, and then round and round the ship in a dazzling haze of light and colour.
"Well, catch something then,"
she called to her onlookers.
"Watch out, G.A.!"
she added, dodging the bemused ghost as she shot past the lookout point. G.A. couldn't help but laugh as she spun about them, and the sleepy deck sprang back into action. Annie's magic was soon working. Curious eyes from even the darkest hideaways of the sea soon came up to see the light show. Even the most reluctant failed notions found the sailors' shouts and cheers infectious as everyone helped to haul the heaviest net of them all on board. Even Tepid rolled up his sleeves, buttoned them, ensured his waistcoat was well protected, found a clean pair of gloves, and helped to pull. None of them noticed the ripple a little way off. A very big ripple. The fish in the water around the boat began jumping as if the water was boiling. Then, without warning, they all darted away like silver arrows. It was one of those moments when everything happens right before your eyes, extremely slowly, but in reality it's a matter of seconds, and there's nothing you can do to stop it as the moment unfolds. Annie was in the rigging, and then she wasn't. Her pink light dimmed and then shone briefly through enormous gills. The shower of seawater soaked everyone. The whole ship reeled like a toy, ropes snapping, wood crunching, and timbers moaning like trees in a gale. Then everything moved downwards as the colossal fish fell out of its leap and plunged back into the sea. Its tail dragged through the rigging, across the deck, and finally disappeared in the tumult of spray. The whole ship was tipped on its side, its broken rail level with the water. The full nets crashed along with barrels, bottles and boxes into the sea, their contents disappearing instantly as they swam joyfully away. There was a terrifying silence. Then, with a tremendous, groaning, creaking effort, the ship began to move back upwards, desperately slow at first, then speeding up until it flung what remained of its masts into the air, swaying violently but mercifully upright. It happened so quickly that at first no one was sure what had just hit them. All except for G.A., who had watched from mid-air as the fish burst out of the water, arched over everyone's head, caught Annie in its mouth, and then crashed down onto the ship. Its immense shining belly landed straight on top of him. A lot of debris, plus a few people, he didn't see who, slid through him and crashed into the water. He darted over and around the ship as it steadied itself, calling out to anyone who could answer, trying to see what damage had been done. In the dim light he saw what looked like Abrian picking himself up, Gina untangling herself from ropes, and heard the voices of several others. One of them sounded like Haidur. A lantern flared, and its flickering glow illuminated the face of Captain Oola. Without a word he set about lighting more lanterns that were still in one piece, then pulled anyone nearby into the centre of the deck and counted heads. 5. Without pausing for breath he headed below, his swift footfalls disappearing amidst the groans of the aching ship. After 10 minutes he re-emerged, followed by 2 others. One of them must have been Morland because he was clutching his precious fruit tree, its leaves falling onto the deck. Oola ordered everyone to light the ship as bright as possible and scan the waters on the starboard side, but the sea was as black as the sky. G.A. circled above, trying to see the whole area, but the lapping waves made it near impossible to make out any figures. The only things afloat were pieces of broken ship being steadily swept away by the strong current. A silent feeling of panic was seeping through G.A. as he scanned the empty waves. Morphea had been in the sea for half an hour now, though it felt much longer. She'd known what to do, of course, and lay flat on her back with her arms and legs spread out like a star, keeping her face above the water. She watched small stars peep out through the thick clouds rolling back in, and felt the soft drizzle of rain on her face. It was almost relaxing if it weren't for her fingers growing numb from cold. She was beginning to shiver, and her heart was beating hard, but she kept calm, running over what had happened in her head. Something had leapt out of the water, over the ship, and almost landed on top of them. She'd gone flying into the sea, along with a large amount of debris. She tried to swim back to the ship, but the current was too strong. No matter how hard she swam, the water pulled her away, even though she'd kicked off her boots. With water in her eyes and mouth, by the time she'd coughed and spluttered her lungs clean, she found herself floating in almost complete darkness, completely alone. She sighed. This was annoying. Dramatic setbacks like this always got in the way when you needed to get an adventure finished. Stupid fish. Stupid ship that couldn't even manage a nudge. Hello? Stupid Tepid. Morphea swam towards the voice, hoping against hope. Hello? It might not be. It still might not be. Why, Morphea, is that you? Oh, good grief, it really was. And it got worse.
I am soaking. I am wet. I do not like this.
I found Dominator floundering amongst the waves, said Tepid, hauling the irate prince by the collar. Morphea, are you there? Morphea felt very tempted to sink out of sight, but somehow her moral conscience kept her afloat.
Yes, it's me. I'm over here.
Morphea, thank goodness. So you fell in the drink too, said Tepid, paddling into view. Dominator emerged, gasping behind him.
Hello, Tepid,
said Morphea levelly. This is, well, terrible, just terrible.
Yes, Tepid.
This isn't what being shipwrecked is meant to be like, surely. None of the old stories mentioned how cold it got. I'm exhausted. Please, could we huddle together for warmth?
No, Tepid. Where's the ship?
Demanded Dominator, fighting to keep upright.
The currents pulled us away. I don't know where it is,
said Morphea. Dominator was not impressed.
Am I going to drown? Tepid, come back here. You're drifting away,
barked Morphea.
We'll have to wait until the sun comes up. That will give us our bearings and will be far easier to find. Why don't we send up a signal with magic?
Said Dominator, though he was barely able to lift one arm out of the water. I don't think that's wise, my dear chap, said Tepid. The fish in this area are clearly drawn to light. Judging by the considerable size of the specimen that struck our ship, I would be reluctant to do anything that might attract others, especially in our vulnerable state. Dominator didn't answer. Tepid was right. The knowledge of a myriad of unknown creatures lurking beneath their feet was a very uncomfortable thought. After some time, the rain began to fall with purpose once again. Any stars were obscured by rolling, pitch-black clouds that blended with the dark sea. By now they were all becoming increasingly anxious, though none wanted to let the others know that. At one point Tepid tried humming a little song, but stopped at the dangerous silence that emanated from Morphea. Time dragged by, and still there was no sign of the ship. The cold was creeping into their bones, and treading water was like wading through treacle. All they could do was hold on to each other and use up as little valuable energy as possible. Over an hour passed. One by one they began to feel drowsy. Morphea fought to keep her eyes on where the horizon ought to be, straining for any sound of a search party or glimpse of a light. The wind blew softly, and the rain scurried against her face. She wondered if the ship had been too damaged to sail. Would they be stuck here waiting all night? Even if they didn't like her or Dominator, the Nausians would prioritise Prince Tepid over almost anything. But were they the only ones out here? Had any of the others fallen overboard? Deep down, she really hoped everyone was all right. Somewhere inside, a little flame, kindled by thinking of them, kept her warm.
Morphea?
She coughed and spat out seawater.
You're falling asleep,
said Dominator, giving her a shake.
You don't want to do that. Where's Tepid?
Morphea said, suddenly aware he was no longer holding on to her arm.
He's flagging down the boat. What boat?
Then a heavy spool of rope fell on their heads, and in seconds 2 pairs of strong arms wrenched them from the grip of the water. Annie stayed very still and kept her eyes shut. This wasn't very nice. It was awfully slimy, awfully dark, and incredibly smelly. The initial shock had long since worn off. Now she was getting annoyed. She tried pushing her legs in front of her, but the walls pushed back. She pummeled all around her, but nothing happened. Right then, Annie had had enough. Keeping her eyes and nose shut, she took a deep breath and exploded in a wave of pink magic. The enormous fish that had her in its throat stopped short as it swam. Something didn't feel right. Something growled from inside it. Then something gurgled. Then the fish felt very, very sick. The next thing Annie knew, she was being propelled forwards in a disgusting surge of bottles, shoes, fish bones, and other indistinguishable chunky objects, including, for some reason, carrots. All flew with her in a cloud of pretty pink sparkles. Morphea sat up, but then found her head being pushed back down. Her arms were pinned to her sides, wrapped tightly in some sort of cloth or a blanket.
Lie still, you're not warm yet,
said a voice, coming from someone stepping over her towards 3 other figures. The floor swayed beneath her and a lantern flickered above her head. This was not their ship. "We should put about now," said a second voice, also speaking above her. "We'll get back to Tengasharu by morning."
The Ziggy must have been feeding again. Travellers must have stirred them up. Funny to think travellers have come so far this way in these days.
Morphea felt like a caterpillar lying there as they stepped around her, speaking to one another in their rolling language, unable to move and her hair dripping into her face.
Morphea.
She rolled over and saw Dominator lying, similarly bound, beside her.
"Are we going to die, Morphea?"
he whispered.
"Shut up!"
Tepid squishing me.
"I have already offered a profusion of apologies," the prince's voice issued from somewhere behind Dominator. "I'm afraid there's little I can do. They clearly want us to lie still."
"Well, obviously,"
said Morphea.
"They're talking about the big fish and they're making ready to head for land."
"I say, do you speak their lingo?"
"Don't sound so surprised, Tepid. It makes me feel very stupid. You know I'm educated."
"Who are they, Morphea?"
said Dominator, craning his head to look at their rescuers. From what he could make out, they were dressed in long, loose-fitting smocks. Each had a single strip of cloth tied tightly about their head, covering most of their hair, which seemed short and dark in the lamplight. "I haven't had the pleasure of meeting anyone like them before," said Tepid. "Though as soon as I'm set loose, I will be thanking both them and our Miss Delilah. Without her, we would have been in a very sticky pinch."
"Delilah?"
Morphea peered over her toes. Delilah was sitting at the prow of the small boat with a blanket around her shoulders. She was the first to be plucked out of the sea by the 2 fisherfolk. She had been soggy and confused, but managed to roughly communicate to them that they must turn their boat about and head along the current to look for others. It had been a long, anxious search, but at last, with a little luck, they found Tepid swimming towards them. Delilah felt scared and out of place amongst her new companions, not knowing what was going to happen next. All she wanted was to see their ship on the horizon, coming towards them to fetch them back to safety. So far, this hadn't happened. Their rescuers were growing reluctant to stay at sea any longer, and were making motions to change their course, when Delilah suddenly stood up, her eyes fixed on the sea ahead.
"What is it?"
called Dominator.
"I thought I saw something moving,"
said Delilah.
"Please, hold this course! Don't move the boat!"
she said, signalling to their rescuers. Both crept forward to see what she was looking at, one holding the lantern high in front of them. The sea rippled black and gold in its light. Amidst the slapping and flopping sound of the waves, they heard a tiny buzzing noise. It was faint at first, zooming from right to left and back again, but growing closer. Throwing caution to the winds, Delilah held up her hand, and white magic shone from her fingers, far brighter than the lantern. She lit up the prow like a star, making them all blink in the sudden glare. Something was dancing about at the edge of the light. Then suddenly it shot towards Delilah, and she seized it in her hands.
"Pippa! It's Pippa, Abrian's little dragon! Oh, hello, Pippa! Are you all right?"
Delilah gasped, extinguishing her light as the rescuers scolded her in their language for risking attracting the big fish. Pippa wriggled and nuzzled her snout into Delilah's hair, trying to claw her way up to her face. Little fire-hearted dragons didn't like the open sea, and this one hated being on its own more than anything else.
"What a clever dragon,"
said Dominator, trying to get up only to have his head forced down again. Delilah held tight to the little creature, despite its claws scratching her hands. Pippa's belly was wonderfully warm in the damp sea air. Only after a minute did she realise there was something fastened around the dragon. Squinting in the dark, Delilah untied a minuscule pouch and pulled it open. Pippa shook herself free and crawled over to lick Tepid's feet while she unfurled a narrow scroll of paper. From ATR to whoever receives. 4 of our comrades are missing. Please search all waters around. Our ship is damaged. We cannot sail in search. If friends are found, send dragon with reply. If friends not found, send dragon with reply at once. Do not harm dragon.
Do you have anything to write with? To write with?
Asked Delilah, signing to the rescuers, but they shrugged, shaking their heads. The tiny scroll was too small to fit a new message on anyway.
What's the news?
Asked Dominator.
We're the only ones who fell off,
said Delilah. Sweet mercy, that's good luck, said Tepid. I was terribly worried. Oh, Pepper, do stop! We'd left the others afloat. How do we let them know that tickles! That we're all right?
Give that message here,
said Morphea, wriggling an arm free.
I have an idea.
Honno had been picking up the remaining pieces of broken timber from the ship's deck when Pippa returned. Everything was eerily silent. The loudest noise was the twang of apprehension strumming over the ship. Bligh was up in the lookout point, his eyes wide and his face tense. As soon as he heard Honno shout, he descended so fast it was as if he'd materialised next to his friend out of thin air. He watched, terrified, as Honno opened the little pouch and pulled out 4 locks of hair, 1 brown, 1 dark, 1 purple, and 1 flaming ginger.
"It's all of them,"
called Honno, as Bligh slid to the floor, unable to hold himself up as relief overwhelmed him. Delilah was safe. Captain Oola strode forward as Abrian took the pouch from Honno.
"Say, look! There's a little piece of cloth in here," Abrian said, holding it up to the light with Pippa on his shoulder.
Oola took it and examined it closely.
Seaward, are you familiar with this?
He asked. Seaward squinted at the scrap.
Looks like Oza. The fisher folk around here wear it and weave it into their sails. It comes from the land at the foot of the archipelago, called Tenga Sharu.
His Highness Prince Tepid is very fortunate,
said Bligh.
The fisherfolk will have put their rudder to the sea by now and headed for home. It'll soon be dawn and they don't fish in daytime.
Then we can presume that's where your comrades have gone,
said Oola, addressing the deck.
We, meanwhile, must keep to our course. The ship won't manage a long journey in its current state, and Oola is our closest port of call.
We really can't go looking for them?
Said Bligh, looking out at the dark sea.
If you would like to chase a smaller, faster fishing boat and a large, broken, slow-moving ship, then yes,
said Morland, shooting a look at Bligh as he gathered leaves off the deck, the fruit tree looking distinctly worse for wear.
Delilah will be all right. She's got Morphea with her, said Abrian kindly.
And what about your pink flaming-hatted friend?
Asked the captain.
You aren't concerned about her whereabouts?
Annie? Honno scowled. She'll be absolutely fine. It's her that made the fish jump. She can sort herself out. Silly, unthinking, ridiculous Annie. Trust her to go and smash everything and lose their dinner. Her showing off had put everyone in danger and lost their companions. Neither Honno or the others felt very concerned about her at that moment. Someone as destructive as Annie was hardly ever in danger. She had got herself into whatever mess she was in, and she would doubtlessly catch up with them sooner or later, in her own noisy, ridiculous way. Of course, this sort of thinking was very unfair, but shock and fear had pushed a lot of Honno's sensible thoughts to one side at that moment. Little did he and his friends know, they would all learn their lesson soon enough.
And, naturally, we have every faith our good Prince Tepid will be able to find his way,
added Bligh, with only a hint of irony in his words.
Very true,
said Oola.
As soon as we've refitted at Oola, we will head straight for Tenga Sharu to collect them.
All these places with funny names, grumbled Honno. They all sound like trouble.
Come now,
said Bligh.
This is a window of opportunity. You must be the seagull of life.
It was very slow going. One of the sails had been badly torn. Their lines were damaged, and they'd lost most of the fish they had caught. The ship crawled across the sea for a day and a night until, at last, a dark shape on the horizon began to emerge. This was Il Nem, the first island of the archipelago. Barely a mile across, it soon gave way to its sisters, Ilpuu and Ilpoa. The tattered ship wove its way through a narrow channel that ran between them. The island stood like teeth shrouded in mist as they rose up from the sea. As they circled round the second of these, Allaire crept into view. It was larger and lay like a crouching animal with a steep ridge sliding down one side. Almost every inch was covered in thick, rain-soaked forest, apart from its north shore where a small village huddled at the foot of a hillside. There were no boats to greet them as the waves drew them closer. Any small craft that were moored near the village looked thoroughly neglected. The sailors took over now, guiding their ship to just outside the harbour and dropping anchor.
"Why have you stopped here?"
asked Gina, feeding Pippa the last of their meagre breakfast.
The waters grow too shallow for our hull,
said Oola.
We'll go ashore in the rowing boat. Now,
he fixed Abrion, Hono and Ie with a stern gaze.
I'm sure you don't need reminding about what happened the last time we struck land. I trust that I won't have to elaborate on the colourful and grisly consequences that will overtake you if anything similar happens again.
Hono and Abrion shook their heads. The captain's smile alone prompted images of very imaginative unhappiness.
Excellent,
said Oola.
In that case, as our official rain stoppers, whatever needs doing on the island is down to you. The worst of our damage should be dealt with in 2 days. Make sure you come with your magic ingredients on time, or I will have the whippets of the sea hunt you down and tear you into very little pieces.
They nodded again, wondering what in the world a whippet was.
Out of our sight, then. Oh, and do wake him up,
added the captain. Ie had been dozing off, leaning against the steps to the stern. Hono made sure to clip him round the head as they went to gather their things. Ie watched as they carefully lowered the boat, then looked out to the waiting island. He was filled with worry, wondering if the others were all right. He dreaded the thought of Delilah getting into some sort of trouble, and a small part of him privately wished someone other than a person like Dominator, or Tepid, or Morphea, had fallen overboard with her. But the worst feeling was the tearing distance that was riven between them. It was like a rope pulled at full stretch, ready to spring back at any moment. All he could do was keep telling himself it would all be all right. Delilah would get back soon. They'd all be back together, and everything would be all right. He felt thoroughly glad when the island of Allaire came into view. This was supposedly where they would find the first ingredient, the mysterious Gormasolsha, which meant they would soon be exploring. For the first time since they had left Maemia and the Owl Isle, they could get on with what they had set out to do, and this helped push his worries to one side.
"Hurry up, Bligh, or you'll get left behind," called Abrion from the rowing boat. "Promise you'll take good care of Pippa, Mr. Seaward."
She will be fed, and will probably keep us all on our toes,
said Seaward, gently plucking the dragon's teeth from his ear. He had rather taken a shine to the little creature, and often snuck her titbits when he thought Abrion wasn't looking. Bligh flew down to the water level, following the boat as the veiled notions pulled towards the village. They weren't good at rowing. Hono almost lost an oar, and the boat was very wobbly. Morland and Haidur stood by the whipstaff, watching their progress.
Don't make a mess of it,
called Haidur.
Remember, you're still in range.